Cyberpunk Edgerunners is very, very, very good. It's an anime that has left one of the most emotionally stunning experiences I've had in a long time. That might come off as slightly weird to the handful of regular viewers of this channel since I've made videos longer than this one in the past about animes that I found to be far less interesting. That's because the reason why I found Edgerunners to be so compelling is fairly singular and straightforward. The downward emotional spiral that's present in the second half takes the viewer along for a impactful but predictable ride, but the anime uses this predictability in order to make those impactful moments hit even heavier. Take that as my quick spoiler-free review of Edgerunners. This video will contain spoilers for Cyberpunk Edgerunners, but I'm going to specify this spoiler warning a little more than usual. I'm not going to talk about the first half in that great of detail, so if you haven't watched the anime, then this video is going to feel like you've been dropped in halfway through. Whether or not this bothers you, that's the spoiler warning. There's not a whole lot I have to say in regards to episodes 1 through 4, as I just said. It's a good set of introductory episodes that gets you acquainted with most of the relevant characters and accustomed to what the world is like. There's a very clear illustration of David's motivations and his general worldview, and the anime also does a pretty good job with a hands-on approach to world building of Night City through scenes like watching the trauma team walk away from a car accident or David not even being allowed to visit his own mom after a surgery because it's not part of his discount package. The brain dance on the moon is visually very nice, and while it takes a bit of time before it becomes truly relevant, it's still a good way to showcase Lucy opening up to somebody. Or at least the impression of opening up to somebody, as it's not clear at the time of the brain dance whether or not Lucy genuinely feels the way that she claims about it. The action in the anime is also very fast, gory, and kind of goofy here and there. I personally think it's really funny to watch sometimes because things get so excessively gory that it surpasses being shocking and into being hilarious. And that's coming from someone who really doesn't like gore in any form of media ever. It's part of the reason why the action always remained consistently entertaining, even if there wasn't any particularly heavy story implications to it, like the first job in episode 3. A special shout out goes to that one for the creative application of David's Sandevistan during the highway sequence. Here's just a few more specific callouts before we talk about things in greater detail and focus. The scene of David getting literally held up by Maine and the gang in episode 3 was good. It's a scene that packs a lot of details together, like how David's mother used to peddle Sandevistans she scoured off her job, a general overview of the new characters, as well as building towards the transition into David's new life. It's a rather densely packed scene, with a lot of smaller components to it that I like. There's something really melancholy about the ending of the same episode that I really liked as well. There's the clear recognition and acceptance out of David that this is his life now, but also that he's yet to find a clear place to fit in. I enjoyed the way that the anime just settles on the scene and lets that feeling of acceptance sink into both David and the viewer. The rowdy party environment sets a contrast to that feeling too, since everybody's getting along well while it feels more like David is on the outside looking in. Cyberpsychosis is the name of the game in the second half of Edgerunners. This is, or at least I view it as, the primary antagonistic force of the anime. It's a condition in which individuals with too much cyberware installed begin to lose touch with reality as they suffer from hallucinations and eventually a fully psychotic breakdown, which usually involves a lot of violence. Prior to the back half of the anime, it's been displayed twice, James Norris in episode 1 and an unnamed person in episode 4. Both of these instances ended with the cyberpsychos in question and other people dead. There's even a special forces group dedicated to dealing with cyberpsychos called MaxTech. That's probably a good enough summary of it for people who haven't seen Edgerunners but ignore the spoiler warning and kept watching. So let's now talk about episode 6. While my opinion of it might change as time goes by, the initial impression I had of episode 6 was that this is one of the best pieces of media that I've ever seen, period. The only other thing that I can really think of that left as profound of an impression on me was episode 9 of SSSS Gridman, and anybody that knows me personally will know just how much I fucking adore that anime. Episode 6 of Edgerunners was so good that it actually kind of pissed me off, since I knew that writing about this episode would become really difficult. There's two things here that made this episode a top-notch experience for me. The first of these is the scene where Lucy demands David to tell her that she can do it. This isn't a scene that I really thought much of the first time. After all, with the shit that Maine had been going through, the actual process of deep diving for Tanaka's data wasn't really where my attention was at, but clearly Lucy still needed a lot of emotional support out of David to move on with this process. David doesn't understand why Lucy needs the emotional support, but he does realize that she needs it regardless. So it's this scene that I didn't really think much of the first time around that ends up becoming the most important moment in the entire episode because the anime takes the words from this scene and twist them around in such spectacular fashion to create emotionally impactful moments twice. Lucy and David escape into the getaway vehicle where they wait for Dorio and Maine. David wants to go help the two while Lucy insists that they should wait in the car and then later that they should get away and leave Dorio and Maine to their own devices. After a back and forth, David eventually says, "Ain't you gonna say you believe in me too?" and dashes off. Sorry for butchering the line delivery, by the way. There's a good reason why I'm not a voice actor. Aside from the very obvious callback to the aforementioned scene, this reminded me a lot of something that Maine told David previously, that David cannot keep acting like a rookie. David knows that Lucy is never going to give him permission to leave the car because, all things considered, Lucy is correct here. It is too dangerous to go back out. David seems to recognize this too, since he never disputes anything she says, but despite this, he simply trusts Lucy to have faith in him and leaves on his own volition. It feels like a part of David's character arc that has finally come to fruition as he shakes off his identity as a rookie and follows a decision that isn't spurred by somebody else. David finds his way to Maine as Maine is preparing to detonate the entire room along with Dorio's body. David pulls out his gun and starts going on about how he's got Maine's back and that they'll all get out of there. Maine then wraps his giant hand around David's gun to tell him that David can't do it. This scene isn't so emotionally devastating for David as it is for Maine. The single best aspect to this episode is how the anime illustrates the stages of descent into cyberpsychosis that Maine experiences. He's been denying it all episode long as he grows increasingly violent and hallucinates over and over. As the attempt to extract data from Tanaka goes awry and Maine's back is to the wall, he kills Dorio during a cyberpsychotic hallucination. The last remaining strings holding him together finally snap and he tears through numerous officers in a blind rage. The ramp up towards this peak is great as there's a lot of smaller things throughout the episode that are slowly piling onto it, like Maine repeatedly injecting immunoblockers or his eyes flickering. It's like a house of cards that you know is going to fall over, but you keep adding more and more cards to it regardless. And that's why the moment of calm and peace that comes after the floodgates have broken open feels so impactful to me. We, as the viewer, have long since accepted Maine's affliction and have been waiting for him to break. There's this really cool tense shot of the anime very slowly zooming in on David's face, accompanied by the sounds of him hyperventilating and the officers entering the building as we anxiously wait for some kind of response out of Maine. And it's when he clutches the gun in David's hand that the anime reveals the acceptance within Maine. You can't do it. David, or for that matter, anybody, cannot save him now, and Maine knows this. Maine knows that he's gone off the deep end and into the abyss of cyberpsychosis. Compare this to the two other examples of cyberpsychosis that have been demonstrated to us, James Norris and the Unnamed Man. We don't know anything about the situation from their perspective. For all we know, cyberpsychosis is simply an unquenchable thirst for violence. The affliction itself was never the relevant threat, it was always the violent individual doing violent things. Even when experiencing things from Norris's perspective through Jimmy Kurosaki's brain dance, all we got to see was the final product, but never how the person got to that point. But now that both David and the viewer have had a direct look into what cyberpsychosis can be like, this aspect of the story becomes so much more interesting and so much more serious. There were all these things that Kurosaki says and shows in episode 5 about cyberpsychosis. The final shot of episode 6 shows David holding on to one of Maine's implants as he and Lucy drive away from the site. These things only add to the grim and foreboding impression that this episode leaves on the viewer about the uncertainty of David's future. Perhaps the single most memorable shot in the entire episode is the last time we get to see Maine look at David. I find this shot to be extremely unsettling. We're looking directly into the face of a man who we've seen fully come apart at the seams. Maine's mind has been completely shot, and we're moments away from the approaching storm. Yet the single most creepy thing about this shot is his eyes. While we and David might be directly looking at him, it doesn't seem as if Maine is looking back at us. Rather, it's almost as if his eyes are seeing through us and into the beyond. There's a soulless, dead quality to his eyes, as if Maine has already passed on, but his body remains to carry out the final task of lighting the imaginary bonfire. Maybe I'm just overthinking a simple shot of a man's face, but regardless of whether or not this was the intended effect, this added a lot to how devastating the entire episode became. So when we find David at the start of episode 7 with even more cyberware installed than before, that grim and foreboding impression becomes reality. We just witnessed in an extremely direct manner what could happen to somebody with too much cyberware. But despite this, David goes even further down the rabbit hole. There's even a shot of him in this episode where his hand is shaking like Maine's did back when cyberpsychosis slowly began to creep in. And despite what Rebecca and Lucy tell him in episode 7, David refuses to dial back to cyberware as his descent into cyberpsychosis continues. He even acknowledges that he killed a completely innocent bystander, yet demands for even stronger immunoblockers to keep his sanity in check. It's like a car crash happening in slow motion. He's lost track of how many people he's killed, but he has to keep going because of the expectations of both his mother and Maine. His increased usage of cyberware comes literally at the cost of his humanity as he's become more machine than human, and as David continues to lose himself, Lucy won't reconnect with him because of her own personal goals that she refuses to tell. Sure, it's revealed later that Lucy's been doing things in the background to help David, but David doesn't know this. As I did some surface level googling both for this video and my own entertainment, I came across this Reddit comment left by Mike Pondsmith, who authored the original Cyberpunk role-playing games. I'm just going to read this specific part of the comment verbatim, so bear with me here. David's starting humanity was probably already pretty high, and before things went to crap, he had a loving mother, a career path, and no more hassle than the average poor guy in a wealthy Ivy League school, so he had lots of buffer. But even so, he still, even after losing all that, was able to make friends, build a replacement family, and, after some prompting, even get a girlfriend, and a mentor, Maine, to create a supportive father figure, so he could definitely handle the stress of added cyberware up to a point. So reading this helped me realize that the things Pondsmith had listed in his comment were things that David was losing one at a time. He loses Maine and Dorio at the same time, with Pilar having died not too long before them, losing both his mentor/supportive father figure as well as a large chunk of his replacement family. And from episode 7 onwards, Lucy acts very distant from David, so he effectively lost his girlfriend as well. All those buffers that helped him manage the burden of cyberware crumble away one at a time as David continued to install more and more, and now things are a lot more clear as to how he began his downward spiral towards cyberpsychosis. By the end of episodes 7 and 8, the ending that the anime is painting is pretty clear by now. At some point, David is going to succumb to cyberpsychosis. How he handles this might be unclear, but the anime has established that David is already going down this path and has no intention of turning back. I can't properly express how the anime makes the viewer feel like complete shit while watching these last few episodes. To keep going with the terrible car analogies, it's as if a car is driving faster and faster towards a cliff. You know it's going to fall off and there's nothing you can realistically do about it. All you can do is anticipate the inevitable. I really like this aspect of the anime. It filled me with this overwhelming sense of dread that only grew stronger and stronger with each episode since I knew I was taking one step closer towards the breaking point. This was really reminiscent of the same kind of dread that filled me back in episode 6 as Maine got closer and closer to breaking, but in a much more deliberately drawn out manner, which only made it feel even worse. It's probably one of the single strongest emotional impressions any anime has left on me, even if I do consider episode 6 to be better than anything that comes after it. Episode 9 is when things become very clear that everything has gone off the deep end. David and his crew are set up into encountering the cyberskeleton and then having David implant the cyberskeleton, or rather, David implants himself into the cyberskeleton. As the viewer, the whole sequence is extremely painful to watch because you know that David and the crew have been set up by Faraday and that Kiwi is just moving along the plan without giving two shits compared to Falco and Rebecca, who are in awe of the cyberskeleton. The anime knows this too and then pushes the envelope by having Faraday fake a call from Lucy to encourage David, even going as far as using the "I believe in you" line, and then Lucy breaking away from Faraday for just long enough to tell David about the setup. And that's all while David's cyberpsychosis continues to kick in at high gear with only the immunoblockers keeping him in check. Immunoblockers that were explicitly stated to be given at a limited quantity by Doc. So every instance of injection that is shown takes everybody one step closer to that inevitability, and you're completely aware of this the entire time. The anime is very deliberate and precise with every single one of these injections, to such a point that it begins to feel like injections of despair directly into the viewer. The single biggest example of this is despite how the anime is pretty clearly driving itself towards the ending, when David restabilizes as the implantation of the cyberskeleton pauses, it feels like a moment of reprieve. Everyone can take a second to breathe. Then moments later, when the dust settles, David emerges completely implanted to the skeleton. It creates this moment of realization that no matter how much hope you are clinging onto, no matter how close you are teetering on the edge, that it's gone now. And I understand that I'm excessively hammering this point home about how watching the back half made me feel like shit, but it really did leave that profound of an impression on me. I hope at least that part's getting across. The ending is exactly as you would expect, and that's why it's so good. In general, the aspects of the finale that were impactful to me were the callbacks to the very start of Edgerunners, David's mother and Lucy's moon. But it's not just because these were callbacks, but rather because these callbacks were executed really well. In the depths of his psychosis, David sees his mother speaking about her aspirations for him. For how important she is to David's character, I'd be a liar if I said that I never forgot about her throughout the entirety of Edgerunners. David injects his final immunoblocker and reaches the top of Arasaka Tower just like his mother wanted him to in what seems like forever ago. That scene is the single most heartbreaking moment in the entire anime for me. The parallel here is so obvious in all the wrong ways. He's fulfilling his mother's wishes in the most literal sense, but completely sacrificed his humanity while dancing on the edge of delirium to do so. Then there's the ending of Lucy on the Moon, where she's reminded of the time she took David through her special brain dance. Lucy did get to go to the moon, but the only person she ever told it to isn't there to see it with her. There's something quietly powerful about being able to see David as a human again, both through the anime's choice of presentation and Lucy's perspective. It really reminds you that, despite David becoming a barely recognizable cyber-psychotic mechanical super soldier, he began as a human that wanted to live up to the expectations of the people he looked up to. And while this is just my own imagination weighing in on things, I'm left with an image in my head of what it would be like if David's mother saw him again at the end of Edgerunners. It's not really relevant to the main story at all, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how that mental image adds to the bitter nature of the ending. I do have a few minor criticisms that I'll list off here before we close off the video, but these really are very, very minor things. Adam Smasher's presence should have been given a bit more spotlight. When you hear the way people speak of him in the final episode, he's clearly some sort of legend throughout Night City. So I kinda wish the anime did a bit more to introduce him. It could have literally been a campfire story tier of writing, and I would have taken it because that would actually kinda suit his boogeyman status really well. From what I read during the aforementioned Googling, it seems that Adam Smasher is a more relevant character in the 2077 game, but I still firmly believe that the anime should have talked a bit more about him to account for viewers that haven't played the game, like me. While almost everything in the anime feels really carefully planned and thoughtfully executed, one of the biggest question marks for me is how he decided to kill Rebecca at the end of episode 10. Adam Smasher jumps off Arasaka Tower and happens to land on Rebecca on the way down. They barely linger on this fact and just go right back into the action, so her death feels extremely unceremonious and like it was used for mere shock value. There is a great emotional scene that plays out as David and Lucy fall from the tower, which is then followed up with equally emotional scenes of David's death and Falco relaying David's last words to Lucy. If the argument here is that Rebecca was sacrificed in order to demonstrate Adam Smasher's level of power, then I'd respond by saying that the anime should have gone even further and put an even greater focus on her death. Extend both the process of her death and the aftermath of it in order to give something that might impact the viewer in a more meaningful way. As it currently stands, Rebecca's death feels more like it exists to very briefly catch the viewer off guard rather than be something more substantial, which is a shame because I kinda ended up liking this character. So that's it for Edgerunners. No matter how I look at it, I feel that this video has undersold the emotional spiral that takes place in the second half of Edgerunners. I don't think there's a way to properly describe how I felt when David ran off in episode 6 or when he stood atop Arasaka Tower in the final episode, but weirdly enough, maybe that's actually the best way to describe it. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider liking it and maybe even subscribing to the channel. Every little bit goes a long way for channels of my size. The most likely candidate for the next video currently is Licorice Recoil, but I absolutely cannot guarantee that in any way, shape, or form. So that's going to be it for me. That's going to be it for the video as well. So once again, thank you so much for watching, and yeah, take it easy.